Let me begin by thanking Father Edmund for this invitation to be here at St. Anthony's Parish to celebrate the Mass for you, but also for those who are joining through the live streaming. This seems to be the way in which we reach out to people during this time of the pandemic, both in terms of gathering, but also in terms of using technology, so that the life of faith might be sustained. We see an example of faith today in the gospel, but it is surrounded by an affliction, one that is identified as leprosy. And what we have come to know is that leprosy, throughout the ages, has been something that has afflicted many people, and it continues. Medical science has identified it as Hansen's disease, a disease that begins to affect not only the tissue on the outside of the body, but also it begins to deteriorate, such that the tissue between bones and ligaments begins to dissolve. And we see that deformity. And even though it's a medical condition, it has throughout the centuries and continues to be a social disease, one that isolates people. And so the term leprosy has also taken on a deeper meaning. It's taken on a social meaning. I'm sure many of us who have been at odds with family or friends might even use the expression, "I'm being treated like a leper," or "I have become a leper." And there are many people who could give voice to this, those who are excluded and those who are isolated for many reasons, not just the physical disease. I dare say that we are experiencing something of this isolation and exclusion during this time of the pandemic. In that first reading, we're given instructions through the Old Testament of how that community dealt with leprosy. The person who was afflicted first went to the priest, not a physician, for the people of that time understood that it had a social and spiritual stigma. And so the priest was asked to do a diagnosis. And then the remedy was one that was basically a life sentence, for a person was excluded from their family and friends. And we know that this practice of quarantining, of isolating people, of socially distancing, does have an effect, but it doesn't provide the cure. And this is what that early community understood. But the person would be forced into a social stigma, one that was very unbearable. We're told that many people were forced to beg, for they could not work. They could not interact with other people. They also took on a spiritual stigma, for people felt and believed at that time that leprosy was a sign of disobedience to God. And so people shunned them. And this is the context in which we then have this wonderful miracle that takes place in the gospel. For Jesus recognizing this man, others distancing themselves from him, this man comes to Jesus and makes an act of faith. For he says the following, "If you choose, you can make me clean." How many times have we ourselves said similar words? "Lord, if you could heal me, you can do it." Or this sense that our faith is somewhat tested, as it has been in these last number of months. It's interesting that this man's invitation to Jesus to heal him is also associated with an act, for he goes and kneels before Jesus. And this is significant because he recognizes the divine power and presence of God working through Christ. And so that act of homage, of kneeling, but we're also told that he begs him, for he recognizes his impoverishedness, his sense of isolation. His poverty is expressed in his begging of Jesus. And this too becomes for us the gestures of faith, kneeling before Christ and begging, recognizing our need because of our impoverishment, because of our sin, because sometimes of our own isolation from God and from others. And Jesus responds in a way that is to be the response of Christians to such realities. Jesus says, "I choose, be made clean." It's an act, what theology says, of solidarity, of being able to stand with. And Jesus touches that leper as we ourselves recognize that many people in our society need to be touched, but we shun from them. We treat them like lepers. People on the street, people in our homeless shelters, people in our own family, we can shun and create in their lives this isolation and exclusion. And so Jesus gives us the response that we must have as Christians to break through sometimes those barriers and to be in solidarity with those who are in need of God's presence. This social exclusion that has been the result of our pandemic has also highlighted forms of leprosy. We've seen the reality of race, of ethnicity, sexual orientation, and even those who are on the front lines serving the most vulnerable. We hear of healthcare workers who are shunned by their family and friends for fear that they will receive or contact the coronavirus. It's this reality that continues to be part of our human condition, that those who are burdened by such sin and sometimes social circumstances, we shun them and create this form of isolation. And St. Paul says to us that we are to be to all people what Christ was to those most marginalized, and how Paul tried to imitate in his own life by building up the people of God. And that is our call today, to build up the people of God, the people of our community, by being like Christ, acting in solidarity with those most in need. For leprosy knows no bounds, no creed, no culture. We shun and we exclude, and therefore we need to be reminded constantly of this need for us as Christians to be in solidarity with those who are most suffering and in need of God's healing presence. May we, who gather at this celebration of the Eucharist, who are healed and strengthened, may we ourselves act in the same way